The New Orleans Saints are expected to sign a long-term lease that would keep them, well, in New Orleans. But how long will that last? We'll talk about it right here on the Straight Up Saints podcast.
You're listening to the Straight Up Saints podcast.
What is up, Who Dat Nation? Welcome back inside another edition of the Straight Up Saints podcast. I'm your host, Chris Rosevoglu. And as always, we're brought to you by Scott Vicknair, injury lawyers who've been injured in any kind of accident, car, truck, 18-wheeler, or hurt offshore. Scott Vicknair handles it all. You give him a call at 504-500-1111 for a free consultation. They'll always fight for the win. So this Saturday morning, you'd expect it to be a really dull morning. Nothing going on for the Saints because it's a Saturday. Training camp's still about 2 weeks away. And yet, here we go. Jeff Duncan reporting on Saturday morning that the Saints and the state of Louisiana, have made significant progress on a long-term lease agreement that could keep the team in New Orleans for 30 more years. Said the agreement would extend the lease through 2035, and it would include multiple 5-year options that combine the team to Louisiana for 2 decades. Beyond that, which obviously is what you want as a Saints fan, is to keep the Saints in New Orleans, hence the team name. So from the start of it, you hear that, you probably think that's great news. Saints long-term lease, everything's good, they're staying in New Orleans. That is the main takeaway. If you only want to read the good news, if you want to read the underlying tone of this article that Jeff Duncan put out there, a lot of it has to do with, yes, right now, the Saints are going to stay in New Orleans. And under this lease, as long as Gayle Benson's the owner, that won't be in question. The question for the team, however, is what happens when you do get to that time that Gayle Benson is no longer the owner of the Saints? Because you'd have to imagine, just going by numbers and just the way life works, Gayle Benson at 77 years old is probably going to sell the Saints within, the next 20 years. Like, you just have to imagine that. So right now, New Orleans is the home of the Saints. And I hope, just like many people, that it will continue to be the home of the Saints. But under these agreements, which, by the way, are always going to happen behind the scenes, it's just not going to be something that we're going to hear about every single passing day. It's going to come sporadically. Updates like this, just like today, how it came out of nowhere. New Orleans has to make sure that it is prioritized in these negotiations. Governor Jeff Landry, who's going to be a major focal point of these talks, has to find a way, as Jeff Duncan put, to have like an ironclad agreement that the Saints remain in New Orleans. Because the future of this franchise technically will be kind of up in the air if they're not doing well and they're not, profiting, and they're not really just an appealing team to this league, and Gayle Benson's no longer the owner. And if you think that that's wrong, just think about the franchises that have been moved. St. Louis, they had the Rams, they lose in LA. That one, all right, not the biggest of deals. The Raiders were relocated from Oakland. That felt like a franchise you never thought was going to get moved from its spot. So if the Raiders could get moved out of Oakland, it kind of feels like any team can if they become monetarily irrelevant. The Saints aren't there. They're not. But it is something worth putting out there, that while it's great to celebrate the fact that they are going to get a long-term, lease agreement, at least it seems that way, and that through at least 2035, your Saints are going to stay in New Orleans. What happens 15 years from now? Are they still in New Orleans? Like, that is the question that has to be asked, because you don't want to be incredibly naive about this. And what goes against the Saints is we live in a time now where all these teams are getting fancy-ass stadiums. Levi Stadium, pretty fancy. SoFi Stadium, very fancy. The Coliseum in Vegas, that thing looks like the fucking Death Star. So we are in a world where teams have fancy stadiums. The Superdome, which is still, in my opinion, awesome to see. I've made it very clear, I don't think there's a better fan atmosphere that you can go to than that. There's something chilling about just the rattling of the fan noise from just thousands. But it is an older stadium as opposed to some of these new things. Go look at what the Bills are going to go get. Go look at the Titans' new stadium. They are building these luxurious stadiums in the NFL because they got the money to. And at some point, the Superdome will kind of feel a little ancient. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. If you look at the MLB, Fenway Park's old as hell, and it has that classic look to it that you admire. But baseball is not the same as football, and the league is very flashy at the moment. So it's just worth putting out there. Still good news this Saturday. The fact that the Saints are getting a long-term agreement in progress and that it seems like they're going forward with talks, that's fantastic. That's all good news. But we got to sit here and hope that keeping the Saints in New Orleans is a priority for the people who are behind the scenes doing these negotiations. And if it's not, that's really unfortunate. If it is, obviously thumbs up, smiles on all our faces, and we're glad. But we'll see what happens, guys. Obviously, it's way too early to see how this is going to play out. But it is an interesting report from Jeff Duncan nonetheless. And I would strongly advise any of you guys, if you want to know more about it, go read what Jeff Duncan put out. Great stuff. And you'll get a little bit more about the behind-the-scenes work of the negotiations taking place between Louisiana and obviously keeping the Saints in the Superdome. So that's going to do for this episode of the Straight Up Saints podcast. Just want to remind you guys, I talked about it earlier this week on John O'Barnes' show, but I'm not going to be here for the next week and a half, but I will have content out and I will make sure of it. There will be a ton of videos over the next couple of days, weeks for you guys kind of leading into training camp. And then once training camp starts, you guys know I'll be back and we'll be talking about Saints football and it'll be all fine and dandy. But until then, future of the Saints, little bit shaky. I don't know. We'll see what happens. For now, they're in New Orleans. Hopefully it stays that way forever, but that's going to wrap it up. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below and I'll get back to you. But until then, guys, stay tuned for more content from the Straight Up Saints podcast, the destination for the Who Dat